Los Angeles, California. January 1969, the sports pavilion attached to the Ed Colt Academy of Martial Arts seated 412 people, and on this particular Friday evening, every seat was filled. The folding chairs had been arranged in a horseshoe around a regulation mat measuring 22 feet across. The ceiling lights were sodium yellow, and they hummed at a frequency just below hearing. The temperature inside the building was 91 degrees. Nobody had opened a window. Nobody had thought to. The event was billed as an invitational skills demonstration, but that was the polite language promoters used when what they actually meant was an open challenge. Every serious martial artist on the West Coast understood the distinction. You did not bring your best students to an invitational skills demonstration. You brought yourself. Bruce Lee was 28 years old that night. He stood 5 feet 7 inches and weighed 132 pounds. He had been training since the age of 13. He had studied Wing Chun under the late Ip Man in Hong Kong. He had fought in the streets, he had fought in the alleys, he had won in both places. He had spent the last 4 years developing a system of combat he called Jeet Kune Do, which translated loosely as the way of the intercepting fist. It was not a style. He was specific about that. It was the absence of a fixed style, which in his view was the only honest form of fighting philosophy could take. By January of 1969, he had already begun work on what would become a body of film that changed the way the world understood what a human body was capable of. But that evening, in that gymnasium, under those sodium lights, most of the 412 people in that room did not know precisely who he was. They had heard the name, some had seen clips, but they had not yet seen what he could do when the distance between him and another man closed to 6 feet. They were about to. In the next 5 seconds, something would happen in that gymnasium that every man and woman in that room would spend the rest of their life trying to describe to someone who was not there. Most of them would fail. The story would travel through dojos and film sets and training halls across 2 continents for the next 50 years, growing in some places and shrinking in others, but never quite disappearing because certain moments have a specific gravity that ordinary time cannot erode. Nobody in that pavilion understood yet that the 5 seconds they were about to witness would redefine permanently and completely what Chuck Norris believed a human being could do. Chuck Norris was 29 years old. He had returned from South Korea 14 months earlier after 5 years of active duty service with the United States Air Force. He had earned his black belt in Tang Soo Do in 1962. He had since added credentials in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo. He stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed 178 pounds of composed, functional muscle. He had begun competing on the karate tournament circuit and had found in it something that felt honest, a structure in which the thing you carried inside you could be tested against what another man carried inside him. Without politics, without theater, without anything except the mat and whatever you had built in yourself through the accumulated decisions of thousands of training hours. He had won. He had won consistently in front of large crowds and small ones, against men who were younger and against men who outweighed him. He had developed a reputation on the circuit for a quality that experienced observers found difficult to name precisely, but could not fail to notice. He was still, not relaxed in the way some fighters used relaxation as a performance of confidence. Still in the way a structure is still when its foundation has been properly laid. Nothing extra moved in him. Nothing wasted itself. He was sitting in the 4th row of the horseshoe that evening, to the left of center, wearing a dark blue sport coat over a plain white shirt. He was watching the demonstrations without visible expression. The man next to him, a tournament director named Roy Grover who had been running West Coast competition events for 11 years, would later say that Norris had the specific quality of a man who was not comparing what he saw to himself. He was simply watching. He was learning. Bruce Lee had been scheduled 3rd on the program. He had arrived 40 minutes early and had spoken briefly to the event coordinator, a compact man named David Feller, who wore a short-sleeved dress shirt and carried a clipboard at all times. Lee had asked about the surface of the mat, whether it had been cleaned, whether it was stable at the edges. Feller had told him it was. Lee had nodded and had gone to stand at the back of the room, alone against the east wall, where he remained without stretching, without warming up visibly, without doing anything that resembled preparation. The first 2 demonstrations were technically accomplished. A senior student from a Pasadena Goju Ryu school broke 6 boards with a ridge hand strike. A judo practitioner named Harrison Mack, who had represented California at a regional championship the previous spring, threw a willing partner across the mat 6 times in sequence and held the final throw so that the man's back was flat and both shoulders were square to the ceiling. The 412 people in the horseshoe responded to each demonstration with appropriate appreciation. They applauded. They leaned to their neighbors and exchanged observations. The evening had the particular atmosphere of a gathering in which everyone present was knowledgeable enough to recognize competence and sufficiently comfortable with each other to express it freely. Then David Feller called Bruce Lee's name. Lee walked from the east wall to the edge of the mat. He was wearing a plain black training shirt and black pants. His feet were bare. He carried no equipment. He did not look at the crowd. He stepped onto the mat and stopped at the center and stood facing the horseshoe's open end. And for a moment he simply existed in the space, not performing patience, not signaling calm, just present in the room with a quality of attention that was difficult to categorize but impossible to miss. What he did in the next 3 minutes has been described in several oral accounts by individuals who were present that evening. The consistency across those accounts is not in the details, which vary in the way all vivid memories vary, but in the quality they attempt to name. He moved through a series of combinations that seemed, to observers trained in conventional systems, to begin too early, to initiate contact before the triggering action that should have prompted them. He was, in the particular language of that community, ahead of what was happening, which should have been impossible, because what was happening had not happened yet. He demonstrated a 1-inch punch. He asked for a volunteer from the front row, and a man of approximately 220 pounds stood up and positioned himself with a pad held against his chest, and Lee placed his fist against the pad at a distance of slightly more than 1 inch, and the man traveled backward 2 full steps and sat down on a folding chair that was not his own. The room made a sound. It was not quite applause. It was the sound a room makes when a small number of its assumptions are revised simultaneously. A man in the second row, 3 seats from the center, named Gerald Cho, a senior instructor with 18 years of experience across 3 disciplines, turned to the man beside him and said quietly that what he had just seen was not possible. The man beside him did not reply. David Feller stepped to the edge of the mat and asked whether Bruce Lee would be willing to take a question from the floor. Lee said he would. Feller looked toward the horseshoe, and a hand went up at the far left of the 4th row, and Feller nodded. The hand belonged to Chuck Norris. He stood without hurry. He did not adjust his collar. He did not look at the people around him, who had turned to see who was asking. He looked at the man on the mat. He said, "Show them your best punch." The room registered the request. It was not a simple request. Anyone in that room with sufficient experience to understand what they had already seen understood also that what Norris was asking for was not a repetition of the demonstration. He was asking for the real thing, unmitigated at full intention. He was asking Lee to show what the instrument was actually capable of when the instrument had a reason. If you have watched this channel before, you already know what it means when a question like that is asked in a room like this. It means the man asking it is not asking for a demonstration. If you want to find out what happens in the next 5 seconds, make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from tonight. Lee looked at Norris for a moment. The duration of that look has been estimated by multiple accounts at between 3 and 5 seconds. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked back at Norris. He said, "Come here." There was a specific quality of silence that came into the pavilion at that moment. Gerald Cho, in his account, would later describe it as the silence of a room in which 412 people have stopped their individual trains of thought at exactly the same instant, which is not something that usually happens. Roy Grover, the tournament director in seat 4 of the 4th row, set his program down on his knee and did not pick it up again. A woman named Patricia Ferris, who had come that evening as the guest of a student from the Pasadena school and who had no particular background in martial arts, would tell people for the rest of her life that she knew at that moment that she was about to watch something she would never see again. Norris removed his sport coat. He folded it once along the lapels and set it on the seat of the chair he had just left. He walked to the edge of the mat. He removed his shoes and set them beside the mat's border. He stepped onto the surface and walked to a point approximately 8 feet from Bruce Lee and stopped there. The 8 feet between them was not dead space. Anyone present who had spent serious time inside a martial arts discipline understood that distance as a live interval, a gap in which an enormous number of variables were being calculated by both men simultaneously: range, angle, the other man's weight distribution, the question of who would initiate and when and with what. 8 feet is in the specific geometry of trained combat neither safe nor committed. It is the distance at which everything is still possible and nothing has been decided. A fight is not 2 men closing distance. A fight is a decision made, revised, and made again in fractions of a second about what that distance means. Every trained fighter in that room understood this. They were watching 2 men who understood it extremely well, standing at the precise interval where understanding it would matter most. Lee turned to the room. He said quietly that he was going to throw 1 punch, that it would be a straight right hand to the left side of Chuck Norris's rib cage, and that he wanted the people in the front row to watch Norris's right elbow. Nobody moved. Second one. Lee's weight shifted backward by a quantity that several observers later estimated at less than 2 inches. His right shoulder dropped approximately 3 degrees. These were not preparatory movements in any conventional sense. They were not the telegraphing motions that every fighter is trained to suppress and every opponent is trained to detect. They were smaller than that. They were the kind of movement that registers below conscious observation, that the body detects before the mind has processed it, that produces in the experienced fighter a sensation of something beginning before anything has visibly begun. Chuck Norris's right elbow moved inward by approximately half an inch. Second, 2. The punch left Lee's body with a quality that has no precise analog in ordinary physical experience. The accounts differ on the sound. Some say there was no sound. Some say there was a sound like a door closing in another room. Patricia Ferris, who had no martial arts training and therefore no framework through which to filter what she saw, said later that it looked like the space between the two men simply ceased to exist and then resumed, and in the interval between those two conditions, something had happened that she could not account for. The punch connected with the left side of Chuck Norris's ribcage at a point 3 inches below the armpit. Norris moved backward. Not stumbled, moved. 2 measured steps, the weight distributed correctly across both of them. The head level. The hands still present at the correct defensive stations. He did not go down. He did not reach for the point of contact. He stood at the new distance, which was now 11 feet from where Lee still stood, and he looked at the man across from him. Second, 3. The room made no sound. Roy Grover's hands were flat on his thighs. Gerald Cho had his right hand raised to his mouth, the knuckle of the index finger against his lips, and he was not aware of this. David Feller had stopped moving. The clipboard was at his side and he was looking at the mat, and his expression was the particular expression of a man who is revising a number he believed he had correctly calculated. Second, 4. Chuck Norris looked at his own rib cage. Then he looked up. Second, 5. He said, again, not as a challenge, that is the specific detail that every account converges on with unusual consistency. He said it the way a man says it when he is at a workbench and has seen a tool do something he did not fully understand, and wants to see it again so that he can understand it properly, because the understanding matters more to him than the demonstration did. He said it with the quality of a man who has just received accurate information about the distance between where he is and where he needs to be, and has found that information valuable. Lee lowered his hand. He walked to the distance of 3 feet, not 8. 3. This was not an aggressive movement. It was a pedagogical one. He was reducing the variable of distance so that the only remaining variable was the thing itself. He placed the back of his right hand against Norris's forearm, lightly, without pressure, the way a teacher places a hand on a student's arm to correct the position of a stroke. He said something that only Chuck Norris could hear. He said it once. Then he turned and walked off the mat. Norris stood at the center of the mat for a moment. His expression has been described in several accounts as unreadable, but Patricia Ferris, who was watching from the front row, described it differently. She said it was the face of a man doing arithmetic, adding something to something else and checking the result. She said it was the most concentrated human face she had ever seen. He walked back to his seat in the 4th row. He picked up the sport coat. He did not put it on immediately. He held it across his lap, and he sat and he watched the rest of the evening's demonstrations with the same quality of stillness that Roy Grover had noticed when the night began, except that it was different now in a way Grover could not name precisely. It was the stillness of a man who had just been given a direction, not corrected, not diminished, given a direction, a bearing, a specific heading towards something he had not previously been able to see clearly. Gerald Cho would tell his senior students, beginning the following week and continuing for the rest of his teaching career, that the most significant thing he had ever witnessed in 40 years of martial arts practice had occurred in those 5 seconds on a gymnasium floor in Los Angeles, and that it had not been the punch. The punch was extraordinary, but the extraordinary thing about it was not its speed or its power, though both were exceptional. The extraordinary thing was what Chuck Norris did with what he had just received. He said, again. In the parking lot afterward, Roy Grover found Norris standing beside his car, the sport coat on now, looking at nothing in particular. Grover asked him what Lee had said, standing at 3 feet, the back of his hand against Norris's forearm. Norris looked at Grover for a moment. Then he looked back at whatever he had been looking at. He said it was private. Grover would carry that answer for decades. He told the story in competition circuits and tournament dinners and instructors' seminars for the next 30 years. He always told it exactly the same way, which is unusual for a story told that many times. He said he believed, based on what he observed in Chuck Norris's face in the 3 seconds after Lee spoke those words, that what Lee had said was not a correction and was not a challenge. He believed it was a direction. A specific, technical, actionable piece of information about what Norris was capable of that Norris had not yet understood about himself. He never confirmed this. Norris, across decades of interviews, acknowledged the evening, acknowledged the punch, and declined, consistently and without elaboration, to repeat what was said. What is knowable is what happened afterward. In the 12 months following that Friday evening in January 1969, Chuck Norris began winning tournaments at a rate that his previous trajectory did not predict. He became world middleweight karate champion in 1968 and would defend that title through 1974, an unbroken run of 6 years. He built a chain of martial arts schools. He began a screen career. He developed a relationship with Bruce Lee that would influence both men's understanding of their art, and Lee would later say, in the private accounts of people who knew him well, that Chuck Norris was the most naturally gifted martial artist he had encountered in America, which from a man of Lee's standards was a specific and serious thing to say. Patricia Ferris became a martial arts instructor. She opened a school in Glendale in 1973. For years, she told new students in the first week of their training that the most important thing she had ever seen in a dojo was not a technique. It was a response to a technique. It was a man taking 2 steps back and saying again, without ego, without performance, without anything except the honest desire to understand what had just happened to him. She said that was the whole thing, really. She said most people, when something exceeds them, look for a reason why it should not have. They look for the explanation that restores the distance between what happened and what they believe is possible. And there are men and there are particular moments in a gymnasium under sodium lights when the most important thing a person can do is refuse to do that. When the most important thing is to stand at the correct distance from what you do not yet understand and say, again. The story traveled the way those stories travel, which is to say imperfectly and in all directions at once. By 1972, it had acquired details that were not in the original. The crowd had grown in some tellings to 800. The punch had broken a rib in certain versions. There were accounts in which the private sentence was a prophecy, in which Lee told Norris that he would be famous, that he would be the most recognized martial artist of his generation. These are the additions that oral history makes when it carries something it wants to be larger than it was. The thing itself was already large enough. What a room full of experienced people saw that January was not a demonstration of superiority. It was a demonstration of the distance between what a disciplined body can do and what the people watching it believe is possible. And what a 29-year-old man from Ryan, Oklahoma, sitting in the 4th row, showed that same room was what a person does when that distance becomes visible. He does not close his eyes. He does not reach for the explanation. He stands there, correctly, and he asks to see it again. The lesson that evening did not belong to Bruce Lee. He already knew it. The lesson belonged to every person in that room who watched what Chuck Norris did in the 5 seconds after the punch landed. The credentials you carry into a room are not the ceiling of what you are. They are the floor. A man who understands that will always be more dangerous than a man who does not, regardless of what either of them can do with a closed fist. Next week, we will look at the evening in 1973 when Steve McQueen walked into a private training session on the Warner Brothers lot and said something to Chuck Norris that cleared the room in 40 seconds flat. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from tonight.